Reggie, do you have your heater on in the background?
Yeah, I was gonna turn it off once we go live.
And then that gives you that timer like before it gets freezing cold.
Yeah, yeah. So then I can prepare myself uh, to stay lively and engaged.
And effects of racism within the body of believers and throughout the world. As a denomination, we believe that dismantling racism is not peripheral to our Christian calling, it's a gospel issue. This webinar is a collective collaboration between the Christian Reformed Church Office of Racial Relations, the Office of Diversity, Antioch Podcast, and Calvin University. This will be an hour-long webinar. The panelists will speak for about 45 minutes and we'll spend the rest of the time in Q&A. So please be sure to put your questions in the chat. This will also be recorded and you'll receive a link to the recording in the next day or so. And I'll introduce the moderator, Eric Nykamp. Eric is an anti-racism educator with CORE, Congregations Organizing for Racial Reconciliation, and a producer for the Antioch Podcast, Conversations about Biblical Anti-Racism. Eric is a staff person at Madison Square Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and a member of the church's anti-racism team. He's also an accomplished musician and artist and enjoys cooking and traveling with his wife and kids whenever there isn't a global pandemic. All right, Eric, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, let me introduce our two chief panelists today. First, Reverend Reggie Smith. He serves as the Director of Diversity for the Office of Race Relations and Social Justice of the Christian Reformed Church. He's served from 2016 to 2020. Before coming to denominational work, he served as co-pastor of Northside Community Christian Reformed Church in Paterson, New Jersey for almost 2 years. He was pastor of Roosevelt Park CRC in Grand Rapids, Michigan from 1994 to 2015. Reggie enjoys meeting new people. I can absolutely attest for that. And traveling to new locations to notice the hand of God at work in the world. He also is an avid fan of the Chicago Cubs baseball team. All right. And also on your screen, Dr. Eric Washington, not to be confused with me, the other Eric here in this program today. He is an associate professor of history and director of African and African Diaspora Studies program at Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's also a member of the board of directors of Africa Network, a nonprofit consortium of liberal arts colleges committed to literacy about and concern for Africa in American higher education. In terms of his research interests, I bet you narrowed this way down because this is short. Okay. In terms of his research interests, he is completing a book manuscript on African American Baptist missionaries in Africa from 1820 to 1920. In addition, he has a growing interest in the intersection of African literature and African history. He's presented papers on the works of Chinua Achebe and various other Nigerian writers and their engagement of history.
Look at him. He got it right. Ooh.
Okay, I practiced at home.
I guess you did.
Okay. So, well, welcome to both of you. We've had fun prepping for this, and I can't wait to hear how our conversation unravels. So let me kick this off with kind of like the question for this seminar. So, Black history, white memory, which begs this question. Why do white and Black Christians remember the history of racial justice so differently? And I'll just tease this out. And I'm wondering, how do we remember personally? How do we remember historically? And how do we remember theologically? And if you want to grab any one of those threads and go for it, that's what we're talking about today.
I'm gonna let the young person go before me.
So, you're gonna do that.
All right. Thank you, elder statesman. Okay, I'll tackle that in terms of looking at memory itself. A pithy short definition of memory in a literary sense, in a social scientific sense, is the the deliberate act of remembering. So when we talk about the differences and the divergence of how Black folk and white folk remember this history, especially pertaining history of social justice, civil rights in this country, well, it's really about the stories that folk have told. Uh, I can go back at least to point to something in popular culture, 1915, D.W. Griffith, The Birth of a Nation.
Yes.
He remembers in that film, he remembers both the Civil War and Reconstruction in a certain way.
Yes.
He looks at the Civil War again. That's part of the lost cause narrative.
Mm-hmm.
This was a noble thing that the South was engaged in, and they lost, but you know, the cause still is still going on. And during Reconstruction, you have now African American men who are holding offices, and in that film, it's focused on South Carolina, and you have he depicts African American men as state assemblymen as uncouth and raucous and uncivilized and barbarous. All right. Now, on the other hand, you have W.B. Du Bois, African American historian, who wrote a book on Reconstruction called The Black Reconstruction.
Yes.
He saw it differently. He saw that Reconstruction there were the ingredients of hope for what we would call racial reconciliation, but that it was undermined. It was undermined because really the Republicans made a deal with unreconstructed Southerners who were Democrats.
Right.
And we had the compromise of 1877.
Right.
And then from there on, the gains that African Americans did have during that time period were washed away because the South, according to the historian C. Van Woodward, gained home rule. And then we have the birth of Jim Crow. So stemming from that, then the experiences of white people and Black people are quite different. So the stories that white folks have passed down about what has happened since then are very different from the stories that Black folks have told. Black folks have stories of lynchings, migrations because they're being forced out, ill treatment because of sharecropping, convict leasing. And we can go on and on. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, you just, Eric, you just kind of set the stage of one of those kind of pivotal moments in American history of how we were trying to answer questions about, from the very beginning, we were trying to answer this question, depending on if you're Black or white. When we first came over in the early 17th century, we had to determine who's Christian and who's not. And out of that came who's human and who's not. And as we move towards the 18th century and 19th century, we struggle with who's a citizen and who's not, which is to beg the question, so who's American and who's not? And those kinds of questions also informs how we remember. We remember about what it meant to be included and what it meant to be excluded. And so when I think getting at that question that you kind of posed, Eric, I think you got to start with that question of who's Christian and who's not Christian. And you got to remember that it was tumultuous for white slave owners. You know, the first 19 presidents owned slaves, and they had to make a determination about, well, if we make them Christian, meaning slaves, then do we have to give them rights? Do they become citizens? Do they become part of this American experiment in which supposedly breaking away from the British to say that they had a pretty bad system of how they talked about citizenry. And now with this new American experience, the colonists are trying to figure out, so what do we do with the personhood of enslaved people in relationship to white people. And so how slaves remember history and how slave owners remember history are totally two different things. Yeah. And the two ain't the same. It's like Sesame Street. These two things are not the same.
I get this feeling that we're watching something like that happening right now. We have January 6th, where we literally had on the steps of the Capitol building, people who are carrying with them symbols of Christianity and symbols of American racism, meeting in public and then trying to beat down the doors, break down the doors of the Capitol building, break down the doors of, so many halls and offices. And we all saw those images on January 6th. And I almost feel like right now we're in this period of rewriting the story where people are spinning narratives about, well, it wasn't what it looked like. Mm-hmm. It was this other thing. There's all these other understandable motives that are underlying this whole thing. I see it happening. We're rewriting our memories, almost like neurologically. We're trying to create different neural pathways that don't go to the obvious conclusion. Right. That this is racism. This is American racism, just like it's always been. Hanging up a noose outside the Capitol building. That's American racism. Yeah. But for us as white folks, and I feel it in myself, like I feel really uncomfortable with the idea that like this just happened. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I want to tell myself things like on January 6th, I told myself that noose is a prop. That's not really intended for somebody. Right. Or these people are crazy. These aren't regular Americans. These are crazy people. And it's like and all these little things so that I can create these little degrees of distance between me and my white self. Yes. And these people that I want to otherize, except that the truth is that they and I have something really significant in common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a lot easier for us, and social psychology kind of, bears this out, is that we love to step up for stuff that we do that is good, but we sure don't want to step up for stuff that we do bad. And all you got to do is talk to children and they'll demonstrate that experiment for you. But Americans have always tried to distance themselves from really what actually is American history about. And American history cannot be told without talking about slavery. And we've been trying to come up with a alternative story, or as Kelly Conway says, alternative facts of what actually happened. Because two people can have the same experience, but have two different experiences. And we see that right after the Civil War. And Eric kind of alluded to that, of the lost cause. The lost cause came because the South, in terms of the white Southerners, couldn't come to grips that they lost. And to come to grips that they lost, they had to come up with an alternative version of what that is. And so they came up with, well, they didn't actually lose. They were actually victorious. That's like the Egyptians, when God kicked their butt in Exodus, saying, you know what? We didn't really lose to the Israelites and God. We were rather victorious. It's like coming up with an alternative that fits of your own cognitive dissonance that you don't really want to recognize. And so the South was doing the exact same thing with the lost cause. And out of that, the Ku Klux Klan came out of this mythology of the lost cause. And because they were able to kind of weave together this story of being a different kind of people, a different kind of culture, a different kind of history, and that there was something noble about it, and that they were trying to correct those scallywags and carpetbaggers from the North who came in and oppressed them Notice the language that they use. We are being oppressed by the North. Have you ever heard this before? And when they began, so what the South did in terms of their own, they wanted to win the narrative race, not the facts race. And they knew that if they could win that race of shaping a kind of narrative in which loss, not dealing with it in the correct way of acknowledging it, but rather mythologizing it in a way in which they can say that here are things are fixed. We know what Black people are. We know that they don't have the same things that we got. We are a little bit higher on the racial totem pole, and it worked. And out of that came the Black Codes. And the Black Codes was the recapitulation of slavery. And because now that through those slaughterhouse decisions from the Supreme Court was able to say, you know what, we should let the states decide because we don't want to get into their business. And we find that the U.S. Supreme Court started handing down decisions that were favorable to Andrew Johnson, favorable to the Southern Democrats. And now they began to rebuild what they felt they had lost. And so here we see how do people deal with loss and end up doing more harm than actually healing themselves.
Wow. Yeah. The imagery of January 6th is not it's not in a vacuum. There's
that's right.
It's a continuum.
Yes.
I had no I didn't stutter when I assessed that this is about race.
Exactly.
Because you're talking about a lost cause. There's a new lost cause that was trumpeted.
Hello.
By the former office holder of this country, the president of this country. That's the new lost cause. And that stirred up all of what happened on January 6th.
Yes.
But it had been bubbling well before that. So I mean, there's been no disjuncture in that.
Right.
So when an African American person like me saw what happened on January 6th, I didn't even say this is some racist stuff. This is some racist stuff. It's racist in the fact that you had a group of mostly white folk. I mean, probably like 99% white people.
Right.
Who had the audacity. The brazenness, the unmitigated gall to say, we gonna go into this joint. We gonna stop the process. Ain't gonna be no certification of the electoral votes. We gonna keep our man in office. That's hey, look, that's some white stuff.
That's come on.
That's like in the context of American history, that is some white stuff. Let's talk about if you're gonna talk about January 6th, you got to talk about Wilmington.
Hello.
This is like the Egyptians when they chased the slaves that had just left Egypt, and they're like, no, you're not. You know, God didn't deliver the slaves out of Egypt. They were stolen by Moses and his Cushite wife. And we're gonna take back. We're gonna take it back.
Wow. Let my people go. Eric, you're just right on in terms of how we see that. Is that if you are a person, you saw exactly what you saw on January 6th, and we saw exactly demonstrations before that. All we have to do is go back to May of 2020, and we saw what happened to George Floyd. And what we saw what happened to George Floyd was no different than what happened in 1921 with the Tulsa race riots, what happened in 1919 when we see this proliferation of riots and massacres that are happening across the United States of white vigilantes who feel a sense of loss about what the world was supposed to be. And they said, we need somebody to blame. We need a scapegoat. Isn't it interesting that Black folk always become the scapegoat to Assange and here for whites to come together again? And even to talk about that great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, who, yes, he had done great things. He did the Emancipation Proclamation, which kind of launches into a new thing called citizenship for Black people. You got to remember the 14th Amendment, that's the first time that citizen is actually used in the Constitution. Before that, we had no understanding what citizen actually meant. It wasn't in there. But the moment that Black people such as Frederick Douglass and others started pushing for, how you look at, and I love this, that Douglass gives this wonderful talk 100 years, I think 50 years after the Civil War. And he gives this talk about July 4th. And he asks this very potent question, who is July 4th for? Yeah. If you're white, he says it's for you. But he says if you're Black and you were enslaved, I ain't got nothing to do with it because it has nothing to do with me. And he's giving this speech to a bunch of white liberals and moderates who think they are woke and find out they ain't as woke as they think they are, because they hadn't contemplated about what does it mean for Black emancipation? What does it mean for Black citizenship? What does it mean for us to actually be a part of this country when for the last 200 years we were not? And so it doesn't take, if you're willing to see history, you got to see history from the eyes of those who are experiencing it, those who are above the line and those who are below the line. Yeah, that determines how you read history.
Yeah, absolutely. And Eric mentioned about Christian symbols.
Yes,
something about good old church folk in that crowd. Again, not surprising at all. I mean, churches split.
Yes.
In the 1840s.
Yes.
Over slavery. Churches split. Everybody split. Baptist split. Methodist split. Presbyterian split. They split over slavery.
Yes.
And since now I am part of the Presbyterian tradition of this country, I have to own that, but I'm a critic of it. And what I do know is that when the Civil War came and you got the split, Southern Presbyterian, Southern Presbyterian talking about, well, we're not gonna say nothing. We gonna stay apolitical. We ain't gonna say nothing about what's going on. Well, your silence spoke volumes. Yes. Your silence on the issue was political. You went along to get along.
And how many?
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Well, how many churches? I mean, they just had a study that came out about how many pastors feel comfortable talking about race.
Yes.
And it found it dropped 17 percentage points.
Yes.
Between what in the last 2 years?
Last 2 years, yeah.
So if you know history, you know that white churches do that. We get quiet, we get apolitical, and we make room for people to do horrible things because we have cowardice, and we're much more interested in keeping our congregation together, because that's in the financial best interest of an institution, is to keep your money in the house.
Right.
But how many of us, we missed that opportunity? We didn't speak out when there were so many examples going on all the time, and we chose to say nothing. And now we're on the other side of it.
Right.
What are we going to do now? Are we going to keep saying nothing because well, we didn't say anything then, and so let's not bring it up now. Now let's just kind of like all hope everybody gets along and just kind of forget about those bad vibes. Or are we going to have the courage to say, you know what, we missed it there. We were complicit. We were quiet, but we want to learn from our mistakes. Are we going to be humble leaders and say, we sinned and we're going to try to make it right now?
Mm.
Right.
I wonder. I wonder.
Yeah, it's really hard for I mean, even just to think about what happened just a year ago, in that the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor brought to the forefront about what people actually saw. Here's what the pandemic was actually, for an irony thing, a good thing, because now not only Black people saw it, white people saw the same thing. And when they saw that officer's knee on George Floyd's neck and they saw the life ebb out of him, there was no dispute in terms of what people actually saw. And for the first time, and there are polls that says this, that that Black Lives Matter, their polls went up, and more by white people because of what they saw. It was as if Bloody Sunday, Selma, Alabama, in which it was the first time that white people saw what the Alabama state troopers did to John Lewis and those marchers. For the first time, they saw with their own eyes. Here's where television put us all at the same place. Maybe there was something good about having only 3 channels back then, ABC, NBC, and CBS, because you all had to write the same thing.
Yeah.
But what happened is that everybody who was on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook all saw the same thing. And they were able to not only see it in real time, but also to see it back in their own homes, because we were all cooped out at home because of the pandemic, right? And we saw the numbers go up. And then less than a year and a half, we saw that Black Lives Matters, their poll numbers plummeted. And it plummeted because now the protesting had ebbed. All the other things were beginning to ebb. And now white folks were saying to themselves, oh, I guess since there's no longer tension about it, it's no longer on the all the news stations. It's no longer being a crawler on CNN. Oh, it goes. We return back to the way that we used to be, and now we're looking just for stability than just justice. And this is classic, because after the Civil War, what happens? Whites on the North and whites in the South reconcile in order to become a united nation, but forgot about Black emancipation. Yeah. They forgot about that the Civil War was about Black people and about slavery, and made it about themselves coming together. Yeah. And what we saw is that Black life, Black citizenship, Black justice got thrown under the bus, and it didn't happen again for another 100 years until we saw this proliferation of Black leadership that was happening in Congress. And we saw that all go away in 1901 when the last Black congressman from North Carolina, and we didn't see it again for another 50 years.
Yeah. I mean, that's it. Circling back to the issue of, again, how do we see things, or why do we see things differently? I mean, there has to be. This has to be a moment. Any really since 1619. I mean, there's never been a moment in this country where the folks who wield the power, the folks who are beneficiaries of the power of the system that has been erected, has said, you know what, this system is wrong. It's jacked up. we gotta blow it up. We gotta change it.
Mm.
No, until something is fixed, it will never be resolved. So you still and within churches, people are still they're not struggling against the concept of institutional racism or systemic racism. They're just flat out denying it.
Yes.
Say racism is just a matter of the heart. So it's an individual sin.
Yes.
So I sin, I'm racist toward you, and it's just me and you, and that's it. But don't realize that this thing is embedded within every system of this country.
Yes.
So you got to face that. It's in the church, it's in the schools, definitely in the legal system, in the penal system, prison system. And you just have to be honest and peel back these things. Just think about everything and say, why has African American unemployment always outpaced white unemployment? Why has African American poverty levels always outpaced poverty level of every other group? Right. See, when you start asking those questions, here's where you really get to know people. Well, they'll say, well, black folks are lazy. Well, black folks don't want to learn. So you pathologize us. So basically, you're justifying our enslavement, and you're justifying our continual second-class citizenship.
Right.
We have to deal with institutional racism. We have to deal with power.
Yes.
These folks, they're just putting pushback in our churches regarding power, because again, we have, especially within Christian Reformed Church, North America, even my church in terms of its presbytery here in Michigan and Ontario, where you have a lot of folks who have immigrated or who are the scions or the descendants of Dutch immigrants who say, well, we came here with nothing. I never said you didn't come here with nothing. But now you got more than I got. I've been here since 1619. You just got here. How did that happen? How did that happen? When you got here, my grandparents, my great grandparents were sharecropping. We went from the plantation. When we went from the plantation as an enslaved, stayed on the plantation as sharecroppers, moved out the countryside and moved into the projects. So, I mean, this narrative about pulling people up by their own bootstraps, you have to put that within the framework of institutional racism and who is designed to benefit. Racism isn't neutral. There are beneficiaries and there are people who are left at the bottom.
That's right.
And I think for white folks, I'll just speak for myself. Whenever I get uncomfortable, where I want to go in my mind is I want to think about the things that I did right or that my people did right. And when we're talking about this American history stuff, I see that kind of remembering at play, where we've had even conversations in the last 4 years about like patriotic history. Well, most of American history has been taught as patriotic history, but where we fall down is that we don't understand or have a common memory of the history of injustice.
Yes.
Which means that we keep perpetuating that stuff over and over and over, because we can't learn from the lessons of the past if we're not talking about them. Pastor Reggie, on the Antioch podcast, you said this thing maybe a couple years ago to me that really was helpful for me in understanding the systemic nature of racism. And I thought I understood it. And then I heard you say this thing. I'm like, oh, I don't understand it like that. And it was this idea that like every so often there's a group of powerful people that get together in a boardroom and make a decision about a bunch of people outside of the boardroom. And very often those people in the boardroom have something in common, and they have something in common with people in boardrooms all across the nation.
That's right.
And that is how racism, one way that racism gets systematized. And for me as a white person, like I really had to sit with that and think about how much I tend to just trust institutions I'm a part of that
Mhm.
like they're trying to do the right thing, and to
Mhm.
realize if they're overlooking groups of people, I'm being generous here by overlooking,
Mhm.
but sometimes it's intentional as
Right.
well.
Right.
But whoever us is, whatever that mental picture of us is, I'm trying to do what's best for us. If that us is excluding some people, and sometimes just excluding people by not having them even at the table making the decision,
Mhm.
and that's how this country has been run for centuries.
That's right. That's right.
We've got major structural work just to get people at tables, or maybe there's a time now where we need to start building new tables.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it's amazing to me, and how the church is complicit in that,
Yeah.
and how the church, uh, sometimes we have to ask really hard questions of our own churches. If we're a part of churches in which there is a white majority, we have to start asking questions. How did people of color actually get into your church? And what part did they really play? And what role did they really play? And who was the savior and who was the patron? Who was the client and who is the one who's actually benefiting from this the most? Because until we start to ask those kinds of questions, it would be easy, even to talk about my own denomination. It'd be easy for us to talk about why do we have the relationship that we have with Black people in the places in which the Christian Reformed Church showed up in, and not ask, well, why are those numbers so low? Why do we struggle when we have Black and white uh, groups together? Why do we always push the multiracial church more than we would push maybe a Black church as the model? We don't make those decisions in a vacuum. We make those decisions because they have to do with our own anxiety. They have to do with our own fear of saying, what if God is up to something that we don't approve of? And we have to do whatever it takes in order to control what God is up to, because it may put us out of business. So which is better?
Yeah.
What God is up to, or what you believe the church should be? And so it really challenges, uh is do we actually believe in the revelation? I'm tired of using the Revelation 7 because that gets used and romanticized all the time, and
Mhm.
it's used in order to say that to have an all Black kind of church is a frightening thing. For who and for whom? And I think that we have to be able to ask ourselves some hard questions of saying, well, Abraham Kuyper was a racist. Yeah, he was. And we get to ask hard questions about why is that, and why some members end up saying, well, or protecting him.
Mhm.
Last time I looked, Abraham Kuyper ain't Jesus. And we can ask questions because we are all human beings who mess up. Not to say that we don't do good things, but we also do bad things. And in order to have a really rich, nuanced history, we need them both. And so stop being scared of taking your supposed great folk off their pedestal. If we got to take down Confederate monuments, we got to take down the Reform ones too.
Can I, as in the last few minutes before we take Q&A, can I ask each of you to talk a little bit about the role of humility in leadership, especially when it comes to issues of race and racism?
Yeah. Humility, Christian virtue, humility, actually a liberal virtue in the sense of the liberal arts. Since I'm at a liberal arts institution, I want to inculcate that virtue of humility among my students. And so to make the connection to what you're pointing at there, Eric, is that leadership has to be able to listen. Humility is listening to folk, flesh and blood folk who are in front of you, talking about their own experiences, talking about their needs, their desires, whatever, talking about their experiences, and listening to those experiences and taking those experiences seriously, especially experiences that have caused trauma.
Yes.
But also humility and listening to the voices of the past, to bring in history. I'll be quick with this. A couple of weeks ago in my church, I preached a sermon coming from Galatians 2. And I led off that sermon with an excerpt from Frederick Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom, when he recalls how when he was in New Bedford, he fled enslavement. He was in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He said, I'm going to go to church. I'm a Methodist.
Yes.
I'm going to go to the church. And he went to Elm Street Church, which was not an African Methodist church. It was just a Methodist building. He went to the church.
Yeah.
He was ushered into the segregated section of the church. And he said, okay, well, maybe this is for, he's reasoning it out, thinking that, well, this is maybe for the people who have scruples. Well, I'll take that. But what drew the line for him is when they segregated the Lord's table.
Yes. Yes.
He didn't take the Lord's Supper that day. He walked out and never came back. So you're talking about humility and leadership. Yeah, as Reggie said, you got to ask the question, why a black person, why a brown person in your church? Don't assume assimilation. Don't assume assimilation. So humility will call us to say that our church spaces, in a predominantly white church space, where you have a sprinkling of black and brown folks, we have to make it safe.
Yes.
We have to make it safe.
Yes. Yes.
You be specific a little bit about what that means from your perspective, because I hear people can nod their heads to that and amen that, but maybe not know what might be involved in making it safe.
I think a church has to be anti-racist intentionally. Has to teach folk and make people aware of the use of microaggressions.
Yeah.
I mean, I experienced microaggressions being in predominantly white churches. And you don't forget.
Yes.
I've never forgotten those things. You don't forget
Never.
things. And they accumulate, and it's part of the trauma. It's part of the trauma.
Yes.
So I don't want to be traumatized continually in the house of God.
Yes.
I don't want to be traumatized. I don't want somebody in my church. Yeah, after Michael Brown or after George Floyd would say, well, he should have complied, or he had drugs in the system. Don't shame a man. Don't shame a person because he or she experienced an atrocity. Just admit it. Admit the truth.
Yes.
That's what I'm talking about in terms of safety.
Thank you.
Yes. And don't make me carry your lost cause. Do your own work. Identify your own biases. Deal with your own blind spots. Enrich your own history. Know about your own history. And begin to do the hard work of, you can't, if you're not a safe person, I have no reason to be around you.
Amen.
You got to do that kind of work. And when you do that kind of work, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you family. It will cost you friends. It will cost you members in your church. But the question is this: do you want to be a follower of Jesus Christ? Or do you want to be beholden to your own lost cause for the sake of whiteness?
All right. We're going to press pause right there. That was really good. I'm glad you didn't drop the mic because those are expensive, but that was
yeah, good. I know.
So the last little bit here, I've been looking through the questions that people have been generous about putting into into the chat here. And if you have one yet, feel free to put one in here. I'm going to find the one that I wanted to start with. Okay. Here's a question. Would all three of you please reflect about the usefulness or helpfulness for Black folks and white folks, and let's also put in there like other people of color, in discussions of white fragility? I ask that because I've seen a fair bit of white fragility while discussing this with an all-white church group.
You want to take a shot at it, Eric?
I was going to say it's a good question, but it makes you take a pause a second.
White fragility. When I think about the term white fragility, I always think back to number one, the movie Malcolm X and autobiography of Malcolm X. When he gave a speech, I think it was in somewhere in New England, and the white girl he perceived was from the South. I mean, she must, like in autobiography, he said she must have got on the plane right after him and went to Harlem, found out where he was, and said, Minister Malcolm, how can I help? And Malcolm said, yeah, you can't help us. Now he reflects later on in autobiography, he should have told it differently, but he wasn't in the right mindset. But to me, she represents white fragility. She knew the wrongs that had been perpetrated and was still being perpetrated, but she was kind of frozen in that moment. Yes. Now, again, Malcolm probably should have dealt with her differently, but I think that's a sign of white fragility. White folks know. White folks know that Black folk been done wrong and still getting done wrong, but they're frozen.
Yes.
Like, what can we do? What can I say? I think in a forum, let's have an honest conversation. Put it out there. I could tell you my mistrust, and you can tell me yours.
Yeah. White fragility is just another way of trying to gain control. It is a way of trying to use anxiety and fragility to control the narrative and can control what is actually happening. Same, just like with Malcolm, it happens to Martin. When Martin Luther King ends up in jail in Birmingham, and he has to, he answers a letter by white clergymen, white liberal clergymen, who make the thing of saying, well, what you need to do, Martin, is to wait and to hold on and embrace gradualism, because if you do that, then everything will work out just fine. And we all know that Martin wrote back on toilet paper, on any scrap of paper he could get his hand on in that jail, and said, it's interesting that white liberals, which I would call fragile, anxious ones, are the same people who says you should wait. But it's not their injustice that's in trouble. Right. It's not their unfreedom that's in trouble. So when you tell Black people to say, wait, it's not the right time, when is the right time? We've been waiting 150 years. 150 years for white folk to do the right thing, to act Christianly. And what we end up getting is, because wait means never. It means it won't happen. And so Martin wrote a very powerful book on the letter from the Birmingham jail, which is a direct response to white fragility that was happening in Birmingham.
I'd like to throw in just a couple other thoughts from my white self. I know that oftentimes when I'm feeling convicted about my lack of knowledge and I'm feeling fragile, I'm going to run to the first person of color I think I have a deep relationship to. Yeah. And that may not be a reciprocated relationship. I'm just going to put that out there. We have this gift, though, living in 2021 called Google. And there's a lot of topics that I'm seeing some things even in the chat, like, can you give examples of this thing or that thing? And I'm not trying to be sarcastic, so I don't want it to come off like this, but Google it. Do your own digging.
Yes.
And
yes.
there are a lot of people of color who have dedicated their lives to teaching white people about what it feels like to be a person of color. And that is not every person of color's burden, but some people have chosen to share. And I'm going to plug the thing you and I do, Reggie.
Mm-hmm.
The Antioch podcast is a weekly conversation between a multiracial group of anti-racism Christian educators and friends. We have a 1 hour in-depth conversation that gets pretty vulnerable every week. And if you want to get familiar with some of the thoughts and ideas around the issue of race from many different perspectives, this would be a great resource to just put in your listening diet, because you'll hear themes and you're going to hear people respond, and you'll get to learn so that when you do have a reciprocal relationship with a person of color, that you have a knowledge base to go off of, where that person doesn't have to become your private tutor. That can be pretty exhausting.
My goodness.
I want to jump to another question a second as well. There's a question in the chat that says, how can my white suburban church fight racism, promote racial justice, and racial reconciliation? And this is kind of off. A similar question was, can you give examples of how to do this that work? I think it means for me learning the truth about white privilege, what it looks like, learning my history, and the shame of wrong things that were done. I'm really blind, but I'm really trying to work on this. So I think that's from our conversation at the end here about, what are microaggressions? How do we create spaces in churches that feel like they honor the image of God in everyone?
My goodness.
It's a big question. You got a shot at it?
That's a huge question.
Yeah.
I think you gotta approach it from making small movements, making small steps. I think doing your own work, maybe even examining what American history do you know? What Christian church history do you know? And start to do that work of plugging in of what was the Black church doing at the same time your church was going on? Or putting yourself in, you got to put yourself in close proximity to people who can model that for you. And I think that when you start to do that, and know that that's going to take an awful lot of time, because Black people, we have been burnt trusting white folk who say one thing and then do another. And that becomes even more damaging and dangerous to us, because then we feel like we're being used, not the kind of mutuality that's really expected. So I would say take an awful long time before you approach, or maybe approach a church for that, because a lot of white churches approach Black churches thinking that they're going to do the work for you. Again, back to what Eric is saying, they can't do the work for you. They got enough work as it is, just trying to keep Black folk from going crazy. And we don't want to spend an awful lot of time helping white folk driving us crazy. So it's necessary to do that work beforehand, and also that be able to handle, and this is in the white fragility category, you got to be able to handle Black anger.
Yeah.
You are not going to escape trying to have the kind of relationship and trust unless you can handle Black anger. What you saw last year was Black anger. Black anger over not having control over our bodies, having a fraught relationship with law enforcement, having the country forget about us and forget about our rights, our justice, and the constant chorus of not yet. No, not yet. No, Not yet.
That is just like the letter from Birmingham jail. 50 years later.
50 years later. And as if Black folk don't have a memory. We do. And American history continues to try to marginalize our history just by giving us 1 month and then forget about us for the other 11 months. I find it interesting. You want to know Frederick Douglass, but you want to put Frederick Douglass back in on March.
Yeah. I mean, the question itself assumes, and I'm not being negative about the question itself, but the question assumes optionality. It assumes that a white church in the suburbs can opt out of this.
Yes.
If you are a Christian church, you cannot opt out of matters of justice.
Amen. Amen.
That's a part of the DNA of the church.
Amen.
You cannot opt out. So yeah, I definitely agree with Reggie that, all right, if you're a white church in the suburbs, maybe you should partner with an African American church that's in the city, or an African American church that's in the suburbs. They got Black churches in the suburbs too.
Yep.
But I think you should partner. You should partner with a ministry that is already doing that work. Partner. Don't put it upon yourself to try to climb that learning curve. Come alongside, listen, partner, and I think the work would be fruitful if it's approaching that in that way.
Yes. That listening is that humble piece.
Yes.
Do we got time for? Do we got time for one more?
Can I add a little something to that?
Yeah. Add a little something.
I know this is a very educated, probably group that we have. Don't make reading books your way out. Because my white brothers and sisters, y'all can read a whole lot of books, but if it doesn't end up in actual action, in which you are actually doing something about it, then I have to ask you, what good is that? You don't get any points for reading a whole lot of books about Black history or about Black people or about justice. You only get courage when you actually do it. You can't read a book about it.
Yeah. True.
I just needed to say that.
Yes.
Reggie cares.
Do we have time for one more? If we do lightning round?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Lightning round. Why are white Christians so quickly to call something political when much of the Black church's justice has been life-giving, rights to freedom, housing, and health, etc.?
Yeah, I think it goes back to my previous point just now. It's because it really depends on what affects you. I mean, white folks will stand outside of Planned Parenthood. White Christians of a certain stripe will stand outside of Planned Parenthood all day long. But if Black Christians say defund the police, it's political. So it again, memory, it is what affects you. It's what affects you.
Right. And it has to be, it's two different ways to go to church. Black people go to church because it's about survival. White people go to church because it's a good thing to do.
Respectability.
This has been a really good hour. I wish we got to go another half hour here, but we have to wrap. There are people that need to get back to work. Thank you to everybody that put feedback in the chat. There's a lot of back and forth here. It felt like it was like kind of like the amen corner a little bit in the chat room there. So
amen.
Good questions. There are good links if you want to copy things out of this, out of the chat. I know that Idella is going to be sending out a link to everyone for this video so that you can watch it, share it with your friends, come back next time. So Adele, are you going to come back on and wish everybody well, or?
You're still muted. You're still muted.
Thank you all for being with us this afternoon, and we hope to see you soon for the next webinar. Thank you, guys. Have a good afternoon.
All right.